The Industrial Generation, 1865 to 1882. This is the generation that watched the world being built brick by brick. They literally turned steam, sweat, and steel into the foundation of what we have today. Born between 1865 and 1882, these were the children of the post-Civil War world. They grew up watching smoke rise from factories instead of campfires, hearing the clang of metal instead of musket fire. America was exploding with invention. Railroads stitched the country together, electricity started to hum in the cities, and telephones were this wild new thing that made people say, "Wait, you can talk to someone miles away?" For this generation, working through 12-hour shifts wasn't just normal, it was survival. These were the very people who looked at a horse and said, "Why not build something faster?" They are also the ones who kicked off what we now call the American dream, the notion that anything is possible with hard work. They looked at the world they were living in, the overconsumption, pollution, brutal working conditions, and saw it as an opportunity to improve. Now, after the industrial generation built the world, someone had actually to live in it, and that's where the lost generation comes in. The lost generation. 1883 to 1900. Born between 1883 and 1900, these were the kids who inherited a shiny new modern world, only to watch it fall apart in the most heartbreaking way possible. They grew up in a time of invention and optimism, airplanes, automobiles, and electricity lighting up entire cities. The future looked bright. But just as they were coming of age, the world decided to throw them straight into the first truly global disaster, World War I. Imagine being 20 years old, full of dreams and ambition, and then suddenly being told to cross an ocean and fight a war so horrific it made everyone question humanity itself. We are talking about trench warfare, mustard gas, and machine guns. When the war ended, these young adults came home with what we'd now call PTSD, but back then, it was just shell shock and a bottle of whiskey. They tried to make sense of a world that no longer made sense, and many of them decided, screw it. Let's drink and dance until we forget writers like Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald captured their disillusionment perfectly. A generation wandering through life with champagne in one hand and existential dread in the other. If the lost generation was the life of the party, the greatest generation was the complete opposite. The greatest generation, 1901 to 1927. They are not great because life was so great in the early 1900s. It's because of the Great Depression. Imagine you are a kid. Life is starting to become smooth and modern. Finally. When suddenly your dad loses his job and you are stuck wondering if every meal will be your last good one. This generation learned early that life doesn't hand out participation trophies. They grew up on rations, hand-me-downs, and grit. They didn't Google how to fix something, they just fixed it. And when things couldn't get worse, they did. Because by the time they were old enough to start families, the world went to war again. World War II. The greatest generation earned that title not from being perfect, but from standing up when everything fell apart. They didn't just fight battles overseas, they built planes, tanks, and an entire economy from the ground up to fuel the fight for freedom. And when the war finally ended, instead of collapsing in exhaustion, they rebuilt the world. We are talking about highways, schools, and suburbs. They built modern America with their bare hands and a level of patience that, frankly, most of us would lose waiting for an Uber. After the chaos of war and depression, the world desperately needed calm. Enter the silent generation. The silent generation. 1928 to 1945. They were born into a world recovering from the Great Depression and raised during World War II. Too young to fight, but old enough to feel the fear in every radio broadcast. When you spend your childhood hearing about rations, air raids, and loss, you don't grow up loud. You grow up careful. This was a generation that valued stability, duty, and conformity. They didn't shout about change. They built it quietly, brick by brick. They were the ones who went to work, stayed at the same job for 40 years, raised families, and believed in saving every penny. And yet, for all their restraint, they were far from passive. This generation gave rise to the civil rights movement, the space race, and the foundations of the technology boom that the next generations would take credit for. They didn't crave fame, they craved security. After watching global chaos twice in 30 years, can you blame them? The silent generation believed in rules because rules kept the world from falling apart again. They got married young, stayed married, and raised the boomers. the kids who would grow up to do the exact opposite. And a fun fact, many of the people who later broke the system started as silents. Think of Martin Luther King Jr., Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and John Lennon, all born in this era. They may have been raised to follow the rules, but some of them grew up and rewrote them entirely. The baby boomers. 1946 to 1964. When the guns of World War II finally went silent, the world exhaled, and then, immediately, started making babies. A lot of babies. The war was over, the economy was booming, and optimism was back on the menu. Suburbs exploded across America. White picket fences became a status symbol, and the phrase, the American dream, suddenly had a visual. Mom, dad, 2 kids, a dog, and a shiny new Chevy in the driveway. For many families, this was the first time life actually felt stable. But don't mistake the picket fences for conformity. While their parents preached restraint, boomers were the first to ask why, and then follow it with why not. But here's the thing about boomers, they were both rebels and rule makers. In their youth, they challenged the system. In adulthood, they became it. They went from protesting Wall Street to running it, from rejecting capitalism to cashing in on it. They built companies, ran governments, and by the 1980s, turned success into a sport. And while they were busy changing the world, they were also making sure their kids, the future Gen Xers, had everything they didn't. That meant colored TVs, credit cards, and a healthy dose of back-in-my-day speeches waiting to be delivered decades later. Generation X. 1965 to 1980. Ah yes, Generation X. The middle child of history, sandwiched right between the boomers and the millennials. And honestly, they're tired of being forgotten. These are the latchkey kids. The ones who grew up when divorce rates were climbing, both parents started working full-time, and MTV actually played music. Gen X learned to be independent early. They came home from school, made themselves a microwave dinner, and learned how to entertain themselves without Wi-Fi because the only thing connected in their house was the telephone cord. They wore flannel before it was ironic, used landlines before they were vintage, and survived childhood without helmets or seatbelts. In the workplace, they became the adaptable ones, the people who could fax you a memo and send you a Google Doc in the same hour. They're raising millennials and Gen Z now, shaking their heads, saying, you know, we actually went outside as kids. Millennials, 1981 to 1996. Now we arrive at the millennials, the generation everyone loves to blame for everything. According to the internet, they killed everything from cable TV to mayonnaise. But, let's be honest, they just refused to keep paying for things that didn't make sense. Millennials are the first generation to grow up online. They're digital natives who remember the sound of dial-up internet, the pain of waiting for a song to download on LimeWire, and the absolute chaos of your mom picking up the phone and disconnecting you mid-chat. This was the generation that lived through MySpace Top 8 drama, AIM-away messages, and the golden age of MSN Messenger before social media became an Olympic sport. They were told, follow your dreams, and then graduated straight into the 2008 financial crisis. Nothing says welcome to adulthood quite like student loans and an unpaid internship that pays an experience. But despite that, millennials are the hustlers, the side gig warriors, the Uber driving, Etsy selling, avocado toast loving survivors of the modern economy. They value experiences over possessions, probably because they couldn't afford houses anyway, but also because they grew up during a time when the world suddenly went global. Travel became accessible, cultures collided online, and suddenly everyone had a platform. Millennials made the internet funny, turning memes into a whole language. Generation Z, 1997 to 2012. And now we enter the age of Generation Z, the kids who were practically born with Wi-Fi in their cribs and iPads in their hands. If millennials were the pioneers of the digital world, Gen Z are the natives who built an entire civilization inside it. This is the first generation that doesn't remember life before smartphones. They grew up with Google, YouTube, and TikTok as their default teachers. They're bold, socially aware, and allergic to BS. They've seen the world's problems streamed live on their phones, from climate change to social justice, and they're not afraid to call it out. But it's not all chaos. This is also the most diverse, inclusive, and globally connected generation ever. They've grown up valuing authenticity over perfection, mental health over hustle, and meaning over money. They're redefining what it means to be cool, because for them, being real is the new flex. They're entrepreneurs at 16, influencers at 18, and burnout survivors by 20. They grew up through pandemics, economic uncertainty, and the wild west of social media, yet they still managed to remix everything with humor, creativity, and brutal honesty. Generation Alpha, 2013 to 2025. And now, the new kids on the block, the iPad toddlers, the YouTube babies, the children of millennials and the younger siblings of Gen Z. These are the kids who learned to swipe before they could write. They're growing up in a world where talking to AI is completely normal. Hi, self-driving cars are a thing, and half their toys come with Wi-Fi. They don't just watch cartoons, they interact with them. They don't ask their parents questions, they ask Alexa, and they'll never know the pain of rewinding a VHS tape, buffering YouTube, or accidentally kicking the console and losing their game progress. But behind the screens, Gen Alpha might also be the most analyzed, tracked, and data-driven generation in human history. Their digital footprints start before they can even walk. From baby monitors to smart toys, every click, tap, and tantrum is quietly teaching tech companies how to sell them something in the future. Socially, they'll grow up more inclusive, more aware, and probably a lot more opinionated, because they've never known a world where their voice didn't matter. They're learning from the chaos of social media, watching climate change unfold in real time, and inheriting a planet that desperately needs some fresh thinking. And let's be honest, by the time they hit their teens, they'll probably be explaining to us how the metaverse works, while we're still saying things like, back in my day, we had TikTok, Generation Beta, 2025 onwards, and finally, Generation Beta. The children of Gen Z, born straight into a world run by AI, automation, and whatever social media platform replaces reality itself. They'll grow up with holograms, not screens. And their first best friend might just be an AI assistant. And there you have it, over a century of human evolution. As Generation Beta comes of age, one thing's for sure. The story isn't ending. It's just loading the next update.